Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's juiciest scandals that probably never actually happened the way everyone thinks it did. We're talking about the sacred prostitutes of ancient Babylon, a story so scandalous that Greek historians couldn't stop gossiping about it, Christian writers clutched their pearls over it for centuries, and Victorian scholars got very excited while pretending to be horrified. But here's the twist. Most of what we think we know about Babylonian temple prostitution comes from ancient gossip, cultural misunderstanding, and a whole lot of projection from cultures that came later. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to connect with our global audience. Now settle in, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's travel back to ancient Mesopotamia, where the line between sacred and sexual was very different from what we're used to, and where a powerful goddess named Ishtar ruled over love, war, and fertility in ways that made later cultures deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Picture Babylon around 1800 BCE, the city rising from the Mesopotamian plains like a fever dream of human ambition, massive walls encircling temples and palaces and markets, the Euphrates River flowing through the center, ziggurat towers reaching toward the heavens, gardens hanging impossibly from terraces, the whole place humming with trade and religion and power. At the heart of this civilization stands something that will confuse and scandalize outsiders for millennia. Temples that aren't just places of prayer, but economic powerhouses, social centers, and yes, places where sexuality and spirituality intertwine in ways that seem completely foreign to later monotheistic traditions. The goddess Ishtar, known as Inanna in the older Sumerian tradition, presides over a domain that seems contradictory to modern thinking. She's simultaneously the goddess of love and war, of sex and violence, of fertility and destruction, of passionate desire and ruthless conquest. She's not a gentle mother goddess or a demure maiden. She's powerful and dangerous and sexual in ways that make her worshippers both devoted and terrified. Her temples are magnificent structures, staffed by hundreds of priests, priestesses, administrators, craftspeople, and various other workers who keep the complex machinery of temple life running. These aren't simple prayer houses, they're economic institutions that own land, employ workers, make loans, store grain, manufacture goods, and generally function as combination church, bank, factory, and social services organization. Among the temple staff are women with various roles and titles, some of them involving sexuality in some form, while others definitely not. All of them more complex than the simple temple prostitute label suggests. The Naditu, for example, are high-status women, often from wealthy families, who dedicate themselves to the god or goddess and live in special residential compounds near temples. They manage property, make loans, conduct business, and are prohibited from having children, though whether they're celibate or simply use contraception is unclear from the texts. These women are powerful, economically independent, literate, and respected, nothing like the image of degraded temple prostitutes that later stories suggest. They're more like a cross between nuns and businesswomen, religious devotees who happen to wield significant economic power. The Kadishtu are different, women whose title means something like holy woman or consecrated one, and their role definitely involves sexuality in some form, but whether this means ritual sex, sacred marriage ceremonies, or something else entirely is endlessly debated by scholars who are working from fragmentary texts and trying to reconstruct practices that the Babylonians themselves considered so normal they rarely bothered to explain in detail. The concept of sacred prostitution, as later cultures understood it, implies a degraded status, women selling their bodies in temples, religious practice as excuse for immorality. But this framework completely misses how Babylonian culture viewed sexuality, divinity, and the relationship between them. In Babylonian religious thought, sex isn't inherently sinful or shameful. It's a powerful force connected to fertility, prosperity, and the renewal of life. The goddess Ishtar embodies sexual desire and power, and expressing sexuality in her honor isn't degrading, it's worshipful. It's channeling divine energy. It's participating in the sacred forces that maintain cosmic order. The sacred marriage ritual, the hieros gamos, is central to Mesopotamian religion, a ceremony where the king symbolically marries the goddess, represented by a priestess, their union ensuring the land's fertility and the kingdom's prosperity for another year. This isn't casual sex or prostitution, it's state religion at the highest level, the king's legitimacy partly depending on this ritual. Whether the sacred marriage involves actual sexual intercourse or is purely symbolic has been debated for decades. The texts are poetic and metaphorical, describing the encounter in erotic language but not necessarily literal terms. The point isn't the physical act, but the spiritual and political meaning, the connection between divine and human power, between sexual potency and agricultural fertility. The priestesses who participate in these rituals are elite women, carefully chosen and trained, performing one of the most important religious functions in the entire kingdom. Calling them prostitutes is like calling the Pope a party planner. Technically, he organizes gatherings, but that description completely misses the significance of what's actually happening. The temple economy complicates everything further, because Mesopotamian temples aren't just spiritual centers, they're major landowners and employers, manufacturing centers and banks, social services organizations providing for widows and orphans, and general hubs of urban life. Women work in temples in countless capacities, as administrators managing property and accounts, as craftspeople weaving textiles and making pottery, as musicians performing in ceremonies, as brewers making beer offerings, as agricultural workers on temple lands, as ritual specialists with various religious functions. Some of these women might engage in sexual activity as part of their temple duties, but that doesn't make them prostitutes in any meaningful sense. They're religious functionaries whose roles happen to include sexuality, just as other temple workers' roles include baking or accounting or animal husbandry. The economic aspect gets even more interesting when you look at how temples handle offerings and sacred resources. Worshippers bring gifts to the gods: food, drink, clothing, precious objects, animals for sacrifice. These offerings don't just disappear into divine coffers, they're redistributed, feeding temple workers, supporting temple operations, being sold to generate revenue for temple activities. If someone makes an offering that includes payment to a temple woman for what later sources call favors, this might be a religious donation, a payment for ritual services, compensation for priestly duties, or yes, possibly payment for sexual services. But all of these categories blur together in ways that make the simple temple prostitution label inadequate. The goddess Ishtar herself is sexually active in myths, taking lovers enthusiastically and sometimes disastrously. Her most famous relationship being with the shepherd Dumuzi, whom she loves and loses in a story that becomes the basis for seasonal fertility rituals. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes a character named Shamhat, a temple woman who civilizes the wild man Enkidu through sexual encounter, teaching him to be human by sharing her body and her culture. This isn't portrayed as degrading or shameful, it's transformative and sacred, sexuality as civilizing force. The word prostitute that later translations use for shamhat is interpretation, not literal translation. Her original title means something more like joyful woman or woman of pleasure, and her role is religious and educational as much as sexual. She brings Enkidu from animal existence to human civilization, teaching him to eat bread and drink beer, wear clothes and live in cities, participate in human society. Her sexuality is the vehicle for this transformation, but reducing her to prostitute misses the complexity of her function. The laws of Hammurabi, that famous Babylonian legal code, mention various categories of temple women and regulate their rights and status. These laws protect temple women's property rights, their inheritance rights, their freedom to conduct business, suggesting they're respectable members of society with legal standing and economic power. Nothing in the legal code suggests temple women are degraded or exploited. They're regulated like any other professional class, with rights and responsibilities clearly defined and protected by law. The Naditu specifically get extensive legal protection. They can inherit property, make their own wills, conduct business transactions, live independently, and maintain significant wealth. If these are prostitutes, they're the most respected and economically powerful prostitutes in human history. The archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows residential areas for religious personnel, administrative buildings, workshops, storage facilities, all the apparatus of complex institutions employing hundreds of people in various capacities. There's no separate brothel area, no distinct red light district within the temple grounds, just the normal infrastructure of large organizations. Pottery and tablets and building layouts don't preserve sexual activities, obviously, so absence of explicit evidence doesn't prove absence of practice. But the material record supports temples as economic and administrative centers rather than elaborate houses of prostitution. The confusion partly comes from later writers projecting their own cultural assumptions backward. Greek and Roman and later Christian authors looking at Babylonian religion through lenses of their own sexual morality and finding it shocking and degenerate. The Greeks had their own sacred prostitution at Corinth, allegedly, although this is also probably exaggerated, but Greek attitudes towards women and sexuality were already complex and conflicted, making them unreliable interpreters of other cultures' practices. The Romans inherited Greek stories about Oriental sexual excess and embellished them further, Babylon becoming shorthand for decadence and immorality in Roman literature, the actual historical practices completely buried under layers of sensational storytelling. Early Christian writers used Babylon as a symbol of corrupt worldliness, the biblical whore of Babylon, representing everything wrong with pagan civilization, sexual immorality, and false religion intertwined. This biblical usage cemented Babylon's reputation as place of sexual transgression for centuries of European culture. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans inherited these stories and believed them uncritically, using them to contrast pure Christian morality against depraved pagan practices, never questioning whether the original accounts might be biased or inaccurate. Victorian scholars who first translated Mesopotamian texts brought their own sexual anxieties and assumptions, seeing references to temple women and immediately jumping to prostitution conclusions, unable to imagine that ancient cultures might have completely different frameworks for understanding sexuality and religion. Modern scholarship has gradually dismantled the sacred prostitution narrative, showing how little evidence actually supports it, and how much it relies on biased ancient sources and modern projections, but the popular image persists because it's too juicy to abandon. The reality is probably much more mundane and complex. Temples employed women in various roles, some involving sexuality and ritual context, some not, all of them participants in religious and economic systems that don't map neatly onto modern categories. The goddess Ishtar's worship definitely included sexual elements, because she's a goddess of sexual love, among other things, and honoring her appropriately means acknowledging this aspect of her domain. But this doesn't necessarily mean prostitution in any sense we'd recognize. Festivals honoring Ishtar might include processions, music, dancing, feasting, ritual drama, symbolic marriages, offerings of various kinds, including possibly sexual services, but all of this happens within religious frameworks that make it sacred rather than commercial or degraded. The line between sacred and profane, between religious duty and personal desire, between ritual and reality, isn't sharp in Mesopotamian culture the way later monotheistic traditions will draw it. Everything is potentially sacred, everything potentially divine. Sexuality no more or less so than eating or farming or making war. Ishtar herself moves between realms, descending to the underworld in one famous myth, stripping off her divine garments and powers at each gate, arriving naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. During Ishtar's absence from the world, all sexual activity ceases, all fertility stops, nothing reproduces or grows, demonstrating her essential role in maintaining life's continuation. Her worship isn't optional luxury, it's necessary for cosmic order, for spring to follow winter, for crops to grow, for animals and humans to reproduce. The priestesses serving Ishtar participate in maintaining this cosmic order. Their rituals and activities, including any sexual elements, serving divine purposes beyond individual morality judgments. The sacred marriage ceremony happens annually at New Year's festivals, part of elaborate rituals renewing creation and re-establishing cosmic order. The king, representing the god Dumuzi, marries the goddess Ishtar, represented by her high priestess, their union symbolizing and perhaps magically ensuring the land's fertility for the coming year. The ceremony includes processions, special clothing and jewelry, offerings and sacrifices, ritual foods and drinks, poetry and music, all building toward the sacred marriage itself, which happens in the temple's inner chambers, away from public view. What exactly happens in those chambers is unknown. The texts preserve the public ritual and poetic descriptions, but not explicit details, leaving scholars to argue whether physical consummation occurs or whether the whole thing is symbolic pageantry. Either way, the high priestess participating isn't a prostitute. She's performing the most important religious function in the kingdom, temporarily embodying the goddess herself, her status and power at their peak during this ritual. The economic arrangements around temples mean that many people's livelihoods depend on temple activities, just as many people today work for churches, hospitals, universities, other large institutions combining spiritual and practical functions. Temple brewers make beer for offerings and festivals, and also for sale, supporting temple operations. Are they sacred brewers or commercial brewers? Both. The categories aren't separate. Temple weavers make cloth for divine statues and priestly garments, and also for trade. Sacred craft or commercial production? Again, both simultaneously. If temple women engage in sexual activities that generate offerings or payments, are they prostitutes or priestesses? The Babylonians probably wouldn't recognize the question as meaningful. The distinction we're trying to make doesn't exist in their conceptual framework. The linguistic confusion adds another layer. Ancient Sumerian and Akkadian terms for temple women don't translate neatly into modern languages. Scholars argue over whether specific words mean prostitute, priestess, sacred woman, holy one, or something entirely different. When Herodotus or other Greek writers describe Babylonian practices, they're translating both language and culture, interpreting foreign concepts through Greek frameworks, inevitably distorting what they're trying to describe. Herodotus's account of mandatory temple prostitution might be his misunderstanding of some completely different practice: coming-of-age rituals, marriage customs, voluntary temple dedications, any number of things filtered through Greek assumptions about Oriental strangeness and sexual excess. Ancient gossip spreads and mutates like modern gossip, each retelling adding details and emphasis, the story getting better and more scandalous with each version, until you're left with sensational tales that might have started from tiny kernels of truth, but have grown beyond recognition. The Christian interpretation of Babylonian religion as demonic deception and sexual immorality adds another layer of distortion. Centuries of sermons and biblical commentary cementing particular readings of these practices as obvious moral lessons about pagan corruption. The Revelation of John uses Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes, as symbol for Rome and worldly corruption. This metaphor depending on assumptions about historical Babylon that probably weren't accurate even when the text was written. But metaphors don't require historical accuracy to be effective. Babylon as symbol of sexual and spiritual corruption serves literary and theological purposes, regardless of what actual Babylonians actually did. The Victorian fascination with these stories is particularly interesting because Victorian culture was simultaneously sexually repressed and sexually obsessed, forbidden topics endlessly fascinating precisely because they're forbidden. Victorian scholars translated ancient texts about sacred sexuality with barely concealed prurient interest, ostensibly shocked, but practically dwelling on every salacious detail, finding in ancient practices license to think about sex while pretending scholarly objectivity. The sacred prostitution narrative gave Victorian men permission to think about exotic women engaging in sexual activities for religious purposes, foreign enough to be shocking, ancient enough to be respectable scholarly interest, the perfect combination of forbidden and acceptable. This Victorian scholarly obsession shaped how temples and temple women were portrayed in popular culture. Paintings and novels depicting Babylonian priestesses as beautiful seductresses performing mysterious, erotic rituals. Images that say more about Victorian fantasies than Mesopotamian realities. Modern archaeology and philology have worked to separate fact from fantasy, reading Mesopotamian texts more carefully, understanding cultural contexts better, recognizing when later sources are unreliable. The emerging picture is less scandalous but more interesting. Temples as complex institutions, women with various religious and economic roles, sexuality integrated into religious life in ways that don't require prostitution label. Some scholars now argue there's no good evidence for sacred prostitution at all, that the entire concept is Greek and later invention, that Mesopotamian religion included sexual elements without involving anything we'd call prostitution. Other scholars maintain that some form of ritualized sexual activity probably occurred in temples, even if not in the way Herodotus described, that the smoke of various ancient accounts suggests some fire of actual practice underneath. The debate continues, probably will continue, because the evidence is fragmentary and open to interpretation, and scholars bring their own assumptions and frameworks to the material. What's clear is that simple temple prostitution explanation doesn't capture the complexity of Mesopotamian religion, the various roles women played in temples, the integration of sexuality into religious worldview, and the economic and social functions temples served. Ishtar's temples were many things simultaneously: houses of worship, economic powerhouses, social service organizations, centers of learning, repositories of tradition, and yes, places where sexuality and spirituality intertwined in ways that made sense to Babylonians, even if they confuse us. The priestesses and other temple women were many things simultaneously too: religious devotees, economic actors, ritual specialists, administrators, craftspeople, and yes, possibly sexually active in sacred contexts, but all of this happening within frameworks of meaning that made them respectable and powerful rather than degraded. Walking through the streets of ancient Babylon, you'd see the great ziggurat rising above the city, Etemenonki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, probably the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel story, 7 tiers of glazed brick reaching toward the sky. The processional way leading to Ishtar's temple is magnificent: walls lined with glazed brick, showing dragons and bulls in brilliant colors, the goddess's symbols displayed for all to see. Processions moving along this sacred road during festivals, the air filled with music and incense and the sounds of celebration. The temple complex itself is enormous: courtyards and sanctuaries, storage rooms and workshops, residential quarters for religious personnel, administrative offices managing the temple's vast holdings, the whole thing functioning as a self-contained city within the city. The statue of Ishtar in her sanctuary is clothed in the finest garments, adorned with precious jewelry, offerings piled at her feet, incense smoke rising constantly, and priests and priestesses attending to her needs as if she's a living queen requiring constant service. And in a sense, she is living. To her worshippers, the statue isn't just representing the goddess. It is the goddess in physical form, her presence inhabiting this material body, her power radiating from this sacred space. The women serving in this temple, whatever their specific roles and titles, are serving directly the most powerful goddess in the Mesopotamian pantheon, the Lady of Heaven, the Queen of the universe, who embodies both creative and destructive power, who bridges multiple realms and domains, who cannot be reduced to simple categories or comfortable moral lessons. As centuries pass and Babylon fades, these women's actual lives and experiences are lost, replaced by stories, rumors, projections. The sacred prostitutes become literary devices rather than actual human beings with complex lives. But beneath the layers of misinterpretation and sensationalism, there were real women doing real work in service of their goddess, navigating the complex requirements of religious duty and economic necessity, power and submission, sacred service and human desire. They weren't simply victims or deviants. They were participants in a religious culture that made sense to them, even if it seems strange to us, acting within frameworks of meaning that valued them in ways that later interpretations erased. The goddess Ishtar herself survives in transformed forms, aspects of her worship absorbed into other deities and traditions. Her power and complexity too fundamental to disappear completely, even as Mesopotamian civilization itself fades into ruin. Greco-Roman Aphrodite and Venus inherit some of Ishtar's attributes, though stripped of her fiercer aspects, tamed into more conventional love goddesses. Astarte and other Near Eastern deities preserve pieces of the tradition. Islamic and Jewish texts reference the ancient goddess in transformed, demonized forms. But the full complexity of Mesopotamian divine feminine power, the integration of sexuality and warfare, fertility and destruction, love and violence, this doesn't survive intact into later traditions that separate these domains more rigidly. As you drift toward sleep now, imagine the processional way in Babylon at sunset, the glazed bricks glowing in fading light, incense smoke rising from countless braziers, the sounds of evening prayers and music, the sense of being in a place where divine and human realms touch, where sexuality is sacred and sacredness is real, where women serve their goddess with devotion that transcends modern categories of virtue and vice. The ruins of Babylon lie silent now under Iraqi sand, the great temples reduced to foundation stones and scholarly reconstructions, the processional way fragmentary and empty, the goddess's voice no longer heard in her sanctuaries. But in imagination and historical study, we can glimpse something of what was, can understand that the scandalous stories we've inherited probably tell us more about the storytellers than the original subjects, that ancient religious practices were complex and culturally embedded in ways that resist simple moral judgments. The sacred prostitutes of Babylon, if they existed in any form like the legends suggest, were probably neither as degraded as critics claimed, nor as liberated as modern reimaginings sometimes portray, but rather women navigating the particular constraints and opportunities of their culture, serving their goddesses in ways that made sense within Mesopotamian religious and social structures. And if they didn't exist, if the whole thing is Greek invention and later embellishment, that's fascinating too, telling us about how cultures create narratives about other cultures, how sexual practices become flashpoints for cultural difference and moral superiority, how easily gossip becomes history when it's about foreign, mysterious others. Either way, the story reveals truths about human cultures and how we interpret each other across time and space. How difficult it is to understand practices outside our own frameworks. How easily we project our assumptions onto fragmentary evidence. The women of Ishtar's temples, whatever they actually did, deserved better than to become symbols of depravity or objects of prurient fascination. They were people, living their lives, serving their goddess, participating in religious culture that made sense to them, even if it seems alien to us. Rest now in contemplation of these ancient mysteries. The goddess Ishtar in her temple, receiving offerings and prayers, her priestesses tending her needs, the rhythms of religious life continuing through centuries before abruptly ending, the silence of ruins replacing the sounds of worship. The sacred and the sexual, forever intertwined in human experience, expressed differently in different cultures, sometimes integrated more openly than others, always complex and resistant to simple categorization. Babylon sleeps now, has slept for millennia, its temples empty, its gods silent, its people long returned to dust. But the questions it raises remain vital about how we interpret other cultures, how we handle sexuality and religion, how we project our assumptions onto others. Sleep peacefully in that awareness, understanding that human cultures are endlessly various, that practices that seem strange or scandalous often make sense within their own contexts, that judgment should be tempered with humility about how much we can truly understand across vast gulfs of time and cultural difference. The processional way grows dark, the last light fading from glazed bricks, the temple courtyards emptying as night falls over ancient Babylon, the goddess Ishtar watching from her sanctuary as she has watched for thousands of years, as she watches still in whatever form divine powers take when their worshippers are gone and their temples fallen. Dream of ancient cities and lost religions, of powerful goddesses and devoted priestesses, of the complexity hidden beneath scandalous stories, of truths that resist simple telling, of human experience in all its sacred and profane dimensions, forever intertwined, forever mysterious, forever resistant to our categories and our certainties. The ziggurat rises in imagination, if not in physical reality. 7 tiers reaching toward the stars. The ascent from earth to heaven made visible in brick and aspiration. Humanity's eternal desire to touch the divine, to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, human and goddess. Ishtar presides over this bridging, goddess of boundaries crossed and realms connected, love and war, heaven and earth, sacred and sexual. Her power lying precisely in her refusal to be limited to single domain or simple definition. Her temples were places of boundary crossing too, where divine met human, where economic met spiritual, where sexuality met sanctity, where women found roles and power within religious frameworks that honored aspects of female experience that wouldn't survive the transition to later religious frameworks, where sexuality and spirituality would be more firmly separated, where female religious authority would be more limited, where the sacred and the sexual would become opposites rather than interconnected aspects of divine power. As the night deepens over ancient Babylon, the temple compounds grow quiet. Oil lamps burning low in windows, the goddess's statue standing watch in darkness, the rhythms of religious life pausing until dawn brings new day of worship and work. The women sleeping in temple residential quarters dream their own dreams, worry about their own concerns, plan for their own futures, living complex human lives that no historical record fully captures, that later scandalized stories completely obscure. They are not symbols or moral lessons, they are people. And whatever their exact roles and duties, they deserve to be remembered as fully human, with agency and complexity, operating within cultural contexts we can study but never fully inhabit. The Euphrates River flows quietly through the city, as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia more, outlasting temples and empires, civilizations rising and falling along its banks, the water indifferent to human dramas and divine mysteries. Babylon's glory will fade, Its temples crumble, its people scatter or assimilate into other cultures. But for now, for this moment suspended in historical imagination, the city lives, the goddess receives worship, the priestesses serve, the complex machinery of Mesopotamian religion and economy continues its daily operations. The sacred prostitutes, real or imagined, symbolic or historical, continue to haunt Western imagination precisely because they represent something both fascinating and threatening: sexuality integrated into public religious life, women with religious authority and sexual agency, ancient practices that challenge modern assumptions about how these domains should be organized and controlled. Whether we're scandalized or intrigued, or both simultaneously, says more about us than about ancient Mesopotamia. Our reactions revealing our own cultural anxieties and assumptions, our own struggles with sexuality and religion and gender and power. The story persists because it touches on perennial human concerns, the relationship between body and spirit, between public and private, between female power and male control, between desire and duty, between the sacred and the profane. Babylon became shorthand for these tensions, the city of sexual and religious transgression, standing in for everything foreign and other and threatening to established order. But actual Babylon was just a city, magnificent and ordinary, sacred and commercial, complex and contradictory like all human settlements. Its temple women were just women, devoted and practical, religious and economic, navigating their particular circumstances with whatever combination of faith and pragmatism got them through. The goddess they served was just a goddess, powerful within her culture's belief system, expressing aspects of divinity that made sense to her worshippers, deserving neither the demonization she received from later traditions nor the romanticization she sometimes gets from modern reimaginings. History is always more complicated than the stories we tell about it, always resistant to simple moral lessons or dramatic narratives, always full of ordinary people doing their best within their circumstances, whatever those circumstances might have been. Rest in that complexity now, the awareness that we can never fully know the past, can only approach it with humility and curiosity, trying to understand on its own terms while recognizing how our own terms inevitably shape what we see. The sacred prostitutes of Babylon, whether they existed as Herodotus described or in some different form or not at all, have taught us something valuable about cultural interpretation and historical imagination, about the dangers of projecting our assumptions onto fragmentary evidence, about the importance of questioning received narratives, however scandalous or satisfying they might be. Sleep comes gently now, carrying you away from ancient Babylon back toward your own time and place, the ziggurat fading into dream, the goddess's voice growing distant, the temple courtyards emptying into memory and imagination. But something remains, some awareness of human cultural variety, some appreciation for complexity beneath scandal, some recognition that sexuality and spirituality have been combined in various ways throughout history, sometimes with outcomes we judge positively, sometimes negatively, usually with more ambiguity than clear moral lessons allow. The women of Ishtar's temples, real or legendary, have this final gift to offer. They remind us that our categories aren't universal, that what seems scandalous or sacred shifts across cultures and centuries, that human experience is endlessly various and surprisingly similar all at once. They lived, if they lived, in a world where goddess was powerful, where temple was central, where sexuality could be sacred, where women could be priestesses serving divine power, where boundaries we take for granted hadn't yet been drawn or were drawn very differently. That world is gone now, buried under Iraqi sand and layered with millennia of interpretation and reinterpretation, gossip and scholarship, scandal and curiosity. But it leaves traces, raises questions, disturbs our certainties in productive ways. Dream peacefully of that ancient world, of processional ways and ziggurat towers, of powerful goddesses and devoted priestesses, of the sacred and sexual intertwined, of boundaries crossed and realms connected, of human cultures and all their bewildering variety. The stars above Babylon shine the same stars we see now. The constellations ancient Mesopotamians studied and named and incorporated into their religious and astronomical systems. The heavens connecting us across impossible temporal distance. Ishtar was associated with Venus, the evening and morning star, brightest object in sky after sun and moon, her celestial manifestation visible and constant, even as her earthly temples crumbled and her worship transformed. The planet Venus still shines, still moves through its predictable cycles, still appears as evening star and morning star, though we no longer see Goddess in its light, no longer make offerings to ensure its continued presence. But the beauty remains, the bright point of light in dawn or dusk sky, and perhaps some echo of ancient awe survives our modern astronomical understanding, some recognition that celestial phenomena can still move us even without religious framework. The sacred prostitutes fade into history and legend, their actual lives unknown, their roles debated, their legacy confused by centuries of misinterpretation. But their story, true or false or somewhere in between, continues to provoke and fascinate, continues to challenge our assumptions about past and present, sacred and sexual, foreign and familiar. Rest now completely, the story told, the questions raised, the ancient world visited and released. Babylon returned to its ruins, the goddess to her silence, and the priestesses to whatever immortality exists in being remembered, however imperfectly, however controversially. Rest deeply, dream well, and carry forward some fragment of understanding that history is complex, that cultures differ profoundly, that judgment should be tempered with humility, that the past has gifts to offer if we approach it with openness rather than certainty. The night enfolds ancient Babylon and modern sleeper alike, the darkness that connects all times and places, the universal human need for rest and dreams, the mystery that remains when all the stories have been told and all the interpretations offered, and we're left finally with silence and sleep and the endless human questions about meaning and truth and how we live together across all our differences. From the temples of Babylon, where sexuality was sacred, we now travel to ancient Rome, where virginity was power, where women gained extraordinary authority by renouncing the very thing that normally defined their roles: sexuality, marriage, and motherhood. Tonight, we're exploring the Vestal Virgins, women who could own property, testify in court without oath, pardon condemned criminals with a word, and sit in better seats at games than senators, all because they maintained absolute celibacy for 30 years under penalty of being buried alive if they broke their vow. These are the most privileged and most terrified women in Roman history, living in luxury while under constant surveillance, honored publicly while imprisoned privately, free from male guardianship, but enslaved to virginity itself. Picture Rome at its height, the Forum bustling with political activity, temples rising on every hillside, the city center of an empire stretching from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. And at the very heart of the Forum stands a small circular temple unique in its architecture, open at the top, containing no cult statue, just an eternal flame that must never, ever go out, because if it does, Rome will fall. This is the temple of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and the flame burning inside has supposedly burned continuously for centuries, tended day and night by 6 women who have given up everything normal to maintain it. The Vestal Virgins, whose virginity somehow guarantees Rome's safety, and whose violation would bring disaster to the entire state. The goddess Vesta is uniquely Roman. She has no myths or stories, no adventures or love affairs or conflicts with other gods. She simply is, constantly present, constantly burning, the hearth at the center of every home, and the sacred hearth at the center of the state. Her fire represents continuity, permanence, the unbroken link between past and present, Rome's eternal existence made visible in flame. If the fire goes out, it's disaster, requiring immediate ritual purification. The responsible Vestal will be whipped. New fire must be created through friction from sacred wood. No convenient torches or coals allowed. The flame must be virgin fire, pure and untainted, just like the women who tend it. The Vestal virgins are selected young, between ages 6 and 10. Chosen by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, from respectable families where both parents are living and the girl is physically perfect without defects. The selection is enormous honor and potential disaster simultaneously. The family gains tremendous prestige but loses their daughter for minimum 30 years. On the day of selection, the girl is literally captured from her father's arms in a ritual emphasizing she's being taken from family authority and placed under authority of the goddess and state. She will no longer be under paternal control, which is extraordinary in Roman culture, where women never escape male guardianship, always under father or husband or male relative. The Vestal lives instead under the authority of the Pontifex Maximus and the goddess, which in practice means she has more autonomy than virtually any other woman in Rome. She can own property independently, make her own decisions, control her own wealth, things utterly impossible for normal Roman women. But this freedom comes with absolute price, 30 years of celibacy, and not just physical celibacy, but symbolic purity. Her body serving as a metaphor for Rome's inviolability, any sexual penetration meaning Rome itself is penetrated, violated, endangered. The training begins immediately. First 10 years learning elaborate rituals under Elder Vestal's guidance, middle 10 years performing duties as active priestess, final 10 years teaching younger Vestals, a 30-year commitment spanning childhood through middle age. After 30 years, she can technically leave, marry if she wishes, return to normal life, but most don't. They stay until death, because where would they go? How would they fit into normal society after spending entire adult lives as sacred virgins, and why give up the respect and power they've accumulated? The daily duties center on maintaining Vesta's fire, which requires constant attention. Priestesses take shifts day and night, ensuring continuous burning, feeding carefully selected wood, adjusting airflow, maintaining perfect flame that must never go out and never dim too much. Beyond fire tending, the Vestals perform crucial roles in religious festivals throughout the Roman year. They prepare sacred cakes from first grain of the harvest using ancient methods. They participate in purification rituals. They witness important legal documents and wills. They guard sacred objects in the temple's inner sanctum, objects so sacred that even speaking of them in detail is forbidden. The Vestal's house, the Atria Vestae, stands next to Vesta's temple in the Forum, a large, comfortable complex with courtyards and gardens, dining rooms and private chambers, libraries and reception halls, an aristocratic residence staffed by numerous slaves and attendants. They live well, better than most Romans, receiving generous state stipends, inheriting property independently, accumulating wealth over decades of service, eating well, dressing in distinctive white robes and special headdresses, traveling in covered carriages, commanding respect wherever they go. They sit in reserved seats at gladiatorial games and theatrical performances, the best seats after the emperor's box, better than senators, better than any other women, visible and honored, their presence lending legitimacy to public entertainment. When they walk the streets, a lictor, an official attendant, walks before them, clearing the path. Anyone failing to show proper respect can be punished. Anyone physically touching or molesting a Vestal faces death penalty. Their persons are inviolable. They can pardon criminals encountered by chance. Supposedly, when a condemned man's execution procession accidentally crosses paths with a Vestal's journey, if she declares him pardoned, he's freed immediately, her authority overriding the legal judgment. Whether this actually happens frequently or is mostly theoretical legal principle is debated, but the fact it's possible demonstrates the Vestal's extraordinary status, more powerful in this regard than magistrates or even consuls. Their legal testimony is accepted without oath, unique in Roman law, where testimony usually requires swearing, but Vestal's word is considered automatically truthful, their sacred status making lying impossible or unthinkable, so their simple statement carries weight of sworn testimony from anyone else. Important wills and documents are deposited with the Vestals for safekeeping, their temple serving as secure archive, their neutrality and reliability trusted absolutely. Emperors and senators and wealthy citizens all using Vestal custody to ensure important papers remain safe and unaltered. Mark Antony supposedly deposited Julius Caesar's will with the Vestals before Caesar's assassination, and after the murder, when various parties wanted to know the will's contents, the Vestal's protection of the document and eventual authorized release played crucial role in the political aftermath. Emperors cultivate good relations with the Vestals, seeking their blessing and approval, understanding that their support lends legitimacy, while their opposition could be politically dangerous. These women, who technically have no political power, nevertheless wield significant political influence through their religious authority. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, gives the Vestals additional privileges and honors, increasing their stipends and granting more prominent public positions, cementing their role in the imperial system, their ancient religious authority supporting his new political order. But underneath all this privilege and power lies the absolute requirement of virginity, maintained not just physically, but symbolically. The Vestal's body serving as guarantee of Rome's safety, her purity protecting the state, any sexual activity meaning disaster for the entire civilization. The penalties for breaking this vow are correspondingly severe and ritualized. When a Vestal is accused of incestum, the technical term for violating her vow, which literally means incest, but is used for Vestal unchastity because she's symbolically married to the goddess and state, the accusation triggers elaborate investigation. The accusation alone is scandalous and dangerous, because if a Vestal is unchaste, this explains any current disasters afflicting Rome. Military defeats or plagues or famines can all be attributed to Vestal violation, making the Vestals convenient scapegoats when Rome needs religious explanation for political or military problems. Several historical instances show Vestals being accused and executed during times of particular crisis, their deaths serving as purification rituals, removing pollution that supposedly caused Rome's troubles, their suffering redemptive for the state. The most famous case involves the Vestal Tuccia, accused but in cestum, but maintaining her innocence. She supposedly performed a miracle to prove her virginity, carrying water from the Tiber River to Vesta's temple in a sieve, the water miraculously not leaking through holes because her purity was intact, divine intervention demonstrating her innocence. Whether this actually happened or is pious legend, the story demonstrates the extreme measures supposedly available to prove innocence when accused, and also the fact that accusation requires defense. The Vestal must somehow demonstrate her continued virginity, despite virginity being fundamentally unprovable. Other Vestals weren't so lucky or so miraculous. The historical record preserves several names of Vestals executed for incestum, and their manner of death is deliberately horrifying, designed to be both punishment and purification ritual. The condemned Vestal is dressed in funeral garments and placed in a covered litter like a corpse. She's carried in solemn procession through the streets to the Campus Sceleris, the evil field, where an underground chamber has been prepared. A small room with a bed, a lamp, and small amounts of bread, water, milk, and oil. She descends or is lowered into the chamber. The entrance is sealed with earth and the ground leveled over it, removing any visible trace. She's left alone in darkness with minimal provisions, not enough to sustain life for long. Death coming slowly from suffocation or starvation or thirst. The exact mechanism uncertain, the horror certain. The ritual carefully avoids directly killing her. No executioner strikes the blow. No weapon sheds her sacred blood. She simply disappears into the earth, removed from the living world without the state technically executing her. The earth itself taking her, or the goddess claiming her, or she simply ceases to exist. Her alleged lover, if identified, faces separate execution by beating, a much more straightforward and quick death. Only the Vestal undergoes the elaborate burial ritual, her sacred status requiring special treatment, even in punishment. The psychological horror of this punishment is immense. The conscious anticipation of death in complete darkness and isolation, the slow realization that no rescue is coming, that the sealed chamber is tomb, that breath will run out or provisions will fail, and death will arrive after hours or days of waiting in absolute darkness. This horror serves multiple functions. It punishes the individual Vestal. It terrifies other Vestals into maintaining their vows. It purifies Rome of pollution caused by violated virginity. It demonstrates the state's power over even the most privileged women, and it reinforces the absolute centrality of virginity to Vestal identity and Roman safety. How often did this actually happen? The historical record is fragmentary. We know of specific cases, but not comprehensive numbers. Probably it was rare enough to be shocking and memorable when it occurred, common enough that the threat was real and constant. Every Vestal living with awareness that accusation was possible and punishment would be terrible. The paranoia this must have created is worth considering. Vestals living under constant scrutiny, their movements watched, their interactions monitored, any appearance of impropriety potentially disastrous, friendship with men dangerous, even necessary interactions with male officials potentially suspicious, the requirement of absolute virginity, creating a psychological prison alongside the physical privileges. And virginity itself, as concept, is slippery and unprovable. What exactly counts as violation? How do you verify continued virginity? What evidence proves or disproves it? The entire system rests on fundamentally unknowable bodily state, making it vulnerable to false accusations and impossible to definitively defend against. The Vestals develop elaborate strategies for protecting their reputations, traveling with attendants and witnesses, avoiding private encounters with men, maintaining a demeanor of absolute propriety, cultivating public image of untouchable sanctity. But even perfect behavior can't guarantee safety from accusation if political circumstances make scapegoat useful. Some accusations are clearly politically motivated, convenient explanations for military defeats or other disasters, the Vestal's supposed violation providing religious cause for secular problems, her execution offering ritual solution to political crises. Other accusations might stem from genuine suspicion or scandal. Vestals are human. They live 30 years under this restriction. Some must have felt desire, or formed attachments, or made mistakes. Whether any actually violated their vows is unknowable from historical distance. We have accusations and executions, but not necessarily truth. The Vestals who successfully complete their 30 years and maintain their reputations accumulate tremendous respect and often significant wealth. They've proven their reliability and sanctity over decades. Their status is unassailable. They're living links to ancient tradition, honored elders who've served goddess and state faithfully through decades of temptation and pressure. Some remain in service after their required 30 years, finding continued purpose in the role, enjoying the power and respect, having no compelling reason to leave. Their entire adult identity wrapped up in being Vestal. Retirement to normal life would be disorienting and diminishing. Others do leave, marry, attempt late-life domesticity, but sources suggest this is often unsuccessful. The curse supposedly falls on women who marry after Vestal service. Their marriage is unhappy or childless, though whether this reflects actual pattern or simply expectation and selective memory is unclear. The idea that Vestals who leave suffer divine punishment, reinforcing notion that Vestal service is a permanent calling. The daily life of a Vestal virgin involves rhythms of religious ritual and domestic comfort. Mornings might involve temple duties and fire tending. Afternoons, administrative work, managing property, or witnessing legal documents. Evenings, social activities or private study in the library. A structured but comfortable existence within the Atrium Vestae's walls. The Vestals eat well. Elaborate meals served by slaves, the best food available in Rome. Their dietary requirements carefully met. They're too important to risk becoming ill from poor nutrition or contaminated food. Their health is state concern. They dress in distinctive garments, white robes symbolizing purity, special headdresses called the suffibulum, marking them as Vestals. Their appearance immediately recognizable, setting them apart from other women, proclaiming their sacred status to everyone they encounter. The Vestals can accumulate personal possessions, jewelry and clothing, books and art, the trappings of wealthy life. They're not living in monastic poverty despite their celibacy. Their renunciation is sexual, not material. They enjoy physical comfort while denying physical pleasure. The relationships between the 6 Vestals living together must have been complex, spanning ages from young girls to elderly women, hierarchies of seniority and experience, possible friendships and rivalries, affections and tensions, all the dynamics of any group living together long-term, but with added pressure of shared fate and mutual surveillance. The elder Vestals train the younger ones, passing down knowledge of rituals and traditions, teaching the precise ways things must be done, the ancient customs that must be maintained exactly, no deviation allowed, continuity of practice ensuring continuity of Rome itself. The chief Vestal, the Virgo Vestides Maxima, holds particular authority. She manages the order's property and personnel, makes decisions about daily operations, represents the Vestals in official dealings, commands respect from her sister priestesses and from Roman officials alike. Becoming chief Vestal represents the pinnacle of this particular path of female power in Rome, leading an ancient order, controlling significant wealth, wielding real influence, all achieved through maintained virginity and religious devotion, rather than through marriage or male patronage. The Vestals participate in numerous religious festivals throughout the Roman calendar, their presence required at certain ceremonies, their ritual actions necessary for proper observance. They're integral to state religion, not peripheral to it. Roman religious life cannot function properly without them. The Vestalia, the festival honoring Vesta specifically, sees the temple opened to Roman matrons who normally cannot enter, women bringing offerings and seeking the goddess's blessing for their households, the Vestals presiding over ceremonies connecting state hearth to domestic hearths, all the fires of Rome symbolically united. During other festivals, the Vestals prepare ritual foods using ancient methods, grinding grain by hand, mixing ingredients in traditional proportions, baking sacred cakes that will be offered to various gods. Their labor sacred because it maintains connections to ancestral practices. The Vestals also participate in fertility rites, despite their own celibacy, because fertility of fields and animals and people is essential to Rome's prosperity, and the Vestals' maintained purity somehow enhances rather than contradicts their role in promoting fertility, the paradox making sense within Roman religious logic, even if it seems contradictory to modern thinking. The presence of Vestals at public events lends legitimacy and divine approval. Emperors and generals want Vestals attending their triumphs and celebrations, their participation suggesting the gods favor these undertakings, their blessing valuable political currency. Conversely, if Vestals publicly withdraw support or express disapproval, this carries weight, suggesting divine displeasure, their religious authority translating into real, if informal, political power. Emperors ignore them at their peril. The Vestals exist in an interesting position regarding gender. They're women, but not quite normal women. They have some privileges, normally reserved for men, like property ownership and legal testimony. But they're still excluded from actual political office and military command. They're simultaneously empowered and constrained by their unique status. Some scholars argue the Vestals are symbolically male, their virginity removing them from female sexuality and placing them in a liminal category that allows male privileges. But this seems too simple. The Vestals are clearly understood as women, their femaleness essential to their function. They embody specifically female purity and its power. The comparison to male priests is instructive. Male priests in Rome don't face similar restrictions or punishments. Their sexuality is not policed the same way. They can marry and have children and sexual relationships without threatening their priestly status. Only the Vestals must maintain absolute celibacy. Only women's sexuality is so dangerous that it must be completely renounced for religious authority to exist. This tells us something about Roman anxieties regarding female sexuality and power. The belief that women can have religious authority or can have sexuality, but not both simultaneously. That female sexual power must be eliminated for other forms of female power to be acceptable. The Vestals navigate this by embracing the restriction, making virginity itself their source of power, turning what could be seen as a limitation into foundation of authority. They're powerful because they're virgins, not despite it. But this power remains dependent on maintained virginity, always vulnerable to accusation, always requiring vigilance and proof, never secure in the way male power is secure, always conditional on bodily state that's ultimately unprovable and subject to others' beliefs and accusations. The archaeological remains of the Atrium Vestae still stand in the Roman Forum. You can walk through the courtyard today, see the bases where statues of notable Vestals once stood. Imagine the daily life that unfolded in these spaces for over 1,000 years. The circular temple of Vesta is partially reconstructed, the open roof and circular form still evident, though the eternal flame is long extinguished, the site now historic monument rather than active sacred space. Tourists snapping photos where priestesses once tended fire. The inscriptions on statue bases preserve names of individual Vestals, women who held this role through various periods of Roman history. Their names and sometimes brief biographical details giving us glimpses of actual people behind the institution. These women had personalities and preferences, strengths and weaknesses. They weren't interchangeable sacred virgins, but individuals navigating the particular constraints and opportunities of Vestal service, making choices about how to inhabit this role, finding meaning or enduring obligation, or both simultaneously. Some inscriptions praise specific Vestals for their devotion or administrative skill, suggesting variety in how different women approach the role. Some excelling at ritual performance, others at property management, still others at navigating political relationships. Different talents finding different expressions within the order structure. The Vestal order survives for over 1,000 years, from Rome's founding legends through the Republic and deep into the Empire, outlasting many other institutions, adapting to political changes while maintaining core identity. The eternal flame supposedly burning continuously through all those centuries. The end comes in 394 CE, when Christian Emperor Theodosius orders the extinguishing of Vesta's fire and dissolution of the order as part of his campaign against pagan religion. The flame that supposedly must never go out finally goes out by imperial decree. And Rome doesn't fall immediately, though it will fall within a century. Close enough that some could claim the prophecy was fulfilled, the connection between Vesta's flame and Rome's existence proving true even in the ending. The last Vestals disappear from history. We don't know their names or fates, whether they converted to Christianity or maintained private pagan worship, whether they received pensions or were left unprovided for, whether they married or lived independently or died soon after. They simply fade from the historical record, along with so many other victims of religious transformation. The comparison to religious women in other cultures is instructive. Nuns in Christian tradition also renounce sexuality and marriage, also live communally, also find within convents opportunities for education and autonomy unavailable to secular women, also face restrictions and surveillance, the pattern repeating across cultures and religions. Celibacy as path to female authority. But the Vestal's potential punishment is uniquely horrifying, being buried alive for sexual activity. No other religious tradition quite matches this combination of honor and terror, privilege and paranoia, power and peril, all balanced on maintained hymen. As you drift toward sleep now, imagine the eternal flame in Vesta's temple, carefully tended through centuries by generations of women who gave their lives to maintain it. The fire never going out, never dimming, constant presence at the heart of Rome, symbol of home and hearth and continuity, and the state's eternal existence. Imagine the Vestals in their white robes walking through the forum with lictor clearing their path, sitting in honored seats at games, testifying in courts, guarding sacred objects, performing ancient rituals, living lives of service and privilege and restriction and power, all intertwined. The fire burns steadily in imagination, if not in reality anymore, the Vestals tending it carefully through day and night, the rhythm of their service marking time, connecting past to present, maintaining the ancient traditions that define what it means to be Roman. Sleep peacefully with that image, the eternal flame and the women who tended it, the power granted through renunciation, the freedom found in restriction, the complex reality of women navigating limited options to create meaningful lives and significant roles within patriarchal systems that otherwise offered them little autonomy. The Vestals show us one way women claimed authority in ancient world, not through sexuality or motherhood, the usual feminine paths to limited power, but through absolute denial of both, through making their very unavailability their source of value, through transforming restriction into privilege. Whether this represents liberation or oppression probably depends on perspective and individual experience. Some Vestals likely thrived in the role and felt genuinely blessed. Others probably endured it and felt trapped. Most probably experienced both feelings at different times, the complexity of human experience resisting simple categorization. Rest now in contemplation of these women who tended the eternal flame, who lived as virgins for 30 years or more, who found power through purity and authority through celibacy, who navigated the narrow space between privilege and punishment, freedom and constraint, respect and surveillance. The temple courtyard grows quiet in evening, the last visitors leaving, the Vestals retiring to their chambers after completing the day's rituals, the fire continuing to burn as it always has, as it always will, until suddenly it doesn't, until history ends one tradition and begins another. But for tonight, for this moment of historical imagination, the flame still burns, the Vestals still serve, Rome still stands secure in the knowledge that the fire burns and the virgins remain pure, and the goddess protects, and all is well, at least for now, at least in memory, at least in the stories we tell ourselves about the past and the women who lived in it. Dream peacefully of white robes and eternal flames, of women who gained power by giving up power, who found freedom in service, who lived extraordinary lives within ordinary structures, who deserved to be remembered as fully human, complex and contradictory, neither perfect saints nor tragic victims, but women navigating their particular circumstances with courage and creativity and the determination to matter in a world that offered them little autonomy. The night enfolds ancient Rome and modern sleeper alike. The darkness that connects all times and places, the universal human need for rest and dreams, the questions that remain when all the stories have been told about meaning and power and sacrifice, and what we're willing to give up to gain authority and respect. The Vestals made that trade, virginity for power, normalcy for significance, 30 years or more of celibacy for lives that mattered, that were remembered, that influenced events and shaped history. Their names preserved in stone and story, even as their actual experiences remain partly unknowable across the centuries. Sleep deeply now, the eternal flame flickering gently in imagination, the Vestals keeping their endless watch, Rome sleeping secure in their vigilance, the cycle continuing as it has for generations, as it will for generations more, until suddenly it doesn't, until all things end, as all human things eventually must. But endings lie in future. For now, there is only the present moment of maintained flame and kept vigil, of women performing their duties, of a system that seems eternal, even though nothing is, of power and privilege balanced precariously on maintained virginity and threatened constantly by accusation and human frailty. Rest in that precarious balance, the awareness that even the most honored positions come with costs, that power is never free, that women throughout history have paid various prices for whatever authority they managed to claim, that understanding their choices requires understanding their limited options, that judging from comfortable modern distance is easy, but perhaps not entirely fair. The Vestals did what they could within their circumstances, some succeeding brilliantly, others struggling, all of them living real lives behind the idealized images and official records, all of them deserving recognition as human beings who navigated impossible situations with whatever combination of faith and pragmatism and courage they could muster. The fire continues burning through the night, steady and constant, needing no attention for these quiet hours, the Vestals sleeping peacefully in their chambers, knowing the flame is secure, their duties fulfilled, their vows maintained for another day. Tomorrow will bring new duties and rituals, the endless repetition of sacred tasks that maintain cosmic order, the grinding routine that is simultaneously burden and blessing, purpose and prison, the structure that gives meaning, even as it constrains possibility. Some Vestals wake eager for the day's rituals, finding genuine fulfillment in service. Others wake reluctantly, enduring obligations that feel more like imprisonment than honor. Most probably experience both feelings, depending on mood and circumstance and how many years they've already served or have yet to serve. The youngest Vestals, recently captured from their father's arms, are still adjusting to temple life, learning the intricate rituals, understanding what their selection means, processing the fact that their childhood ended abruptly, and their adult life will be defined entirely by this service they didn't choose, but now cannot escape. The middle Vestals, in their active service years, carry the heaviest ritual burdens. They're experienced enough to handle complex ceremonies, but still young enough for the physical demands. They're also at ages when normal Roman women would be marrying and having children, when the contrast between their lives and what might have been is most stark and possibly painful. The elder Vestals, completing their final teaching years or staying on after their required service ends, have settled into their identities. They are Vestals. This is who they are. Any other life is unimaginable now. They've made peace with their choices or lack of choices. They've found meaning in service, or at least acceptance of their fate. The bonds between these women, living together for decades, must be intense and complicated. Sisterhood of circumstance, if not always of affection. Shared experience creating connection, even when personalities clash. The knowledge that only these other 5 women truly understand what it means to be Vestal, creating intimacy despite differences. They witness each other's struggles and triumphs, support each other through difficulties, celebrate each other's accomplishments, mourn together when one of their number dies or is accused or leaves the order. Their family by circumstance, if not blood, bound together by shared service to the goddess and shared vigilance over the flame. The politics within any group of 6 women living together for years must be intricate. Hierarchies of age and experience creating structure, but personalities and competencies creating different dynamics. Some Vestals naturally leading, others following. Some forming closer friendships, others maintaining professional distance. The human complexity that exists in any community. The outside world sees only the unified front, the Vestals as collective embodying sacred virginity and Roman continuity. But inside the atrium vesta, there are individuals with preferences and prejudices, talents and weaknesses, all the normal human variety contained within the extraordinary constraints of their shared role. As years pass and Rome changes around them, new emperors rising and falling, wars won and lost, territories gained and lost, political systems transforming, the Vestals remain constant, their rituals unchanged, their service continuing, their presence providing stability and continuity in uncertain times. This constancy is part of their function. They represent the eternal Rome, the unchanging essence beneath all the political turmoil, the connection to ancestral traditions that legitimizes current power structures. They're living links to the past, to Rome's founding, to the ancient customs that define Roman identity. But this also means they're increasingly anachronistic as Rome changes, as Christianity spreads and old pagan practices seem outdated, as values shift and different religious frameworks take hold. The Vestals representing a tradition that's dying before the official end comes. The final Vestals, those serving when Theodosius extinguishes the fire, must have sensed this, must have understood that their world is ending, that the ancient order they've served faithfully is being swept away by historical changes beyond their control, that everything they've sacrificed for is being declared worthless by new authorities who don't value what they represent. How did they feel in those final moments, watching the eternal flame being deliberately extinguished, knowing their service is ending, not through natural decline, but through imperial order, through one religion's victory over another, through political decisions that render their entire lives' work obsolete? We don't know. They left no final testaments or emotional statements. They simply disappear from history. The order dissolved, the tradition ended. The flame that supposedly must never go out, going out forever. And Rome continues briefly before falling, suggesting perhaps the prophecy was true, or perhaps it was simply coincidence that these two endings happened close together. The ruins of the temple and atrium stand now as monument to ended tradition, to women who lived differently, to religious system that made sense to its participants even if it seems strange to us, to the variety of ways human cultures organize relationships between sexuality, power, religion, and gender. The comparison to Babylon's temple women is instructive, even though we never stated it explicitly in this telling. Two very different approaches to sacred femininity, one embracing sexuality as divine power, the other renouncing sexuality to achieve different kind of power, both giving some women authority in patriarchal societies, both making women's bodies central to maintaining cosmic and political order. Neither system was perfect. Both involved constraints and controls. Both made some women powerful while restricting most women to domestic roles. Both deserve understanding on their own terms, rather than simple judgment from modern perspectives shaped by different values and possibilities. Rest now in that understanding, the awareness that history offers complex examples rather than simple lessons, that women throughout history have navigated patriarchy with creativity and courage, finding power where they could, making meaning within constraints, living lives that mattered even when their options were limited. The eternal flame flickers lower now, the oil burning down, but the attending vestal will replenish it soon, the flame never allowed to fail, the vigilance never ceasing, the cycle continuing as it has for centuries, as it will for centuries more, until suddenly it doesn't, until all things end, as all human things must eventually end. Sleep peacefully in contemplation of impermanence and continuity, of traditions that seem eternal until they're not, of women who sacrificed normalcy for significance, of power gained through renunciation, of the many ways humans have tried to connect with divine forces and maintain cosmic order through ritual and restriction and devotion. The Vestals kept the flame, Rome stood, the goddess watched, the cycle continued for over 1,000 years, an impressive run by any standard, a tradition that gave meaning to hundreds of women's lives across generations, that provided stability and continuity through enormous historical changes, that deserves remembering even after ending. Dream well, dream peacefully. Let the image of the eternal flame guide you into restful sleep, the gentle flicker of firelight, the quiet dedication of women keeping watch, the sense of sacred duty fulfilled, the comfort of routine and ritual and purpose, even if that purpose seems strange from modern distance. The night deepens, the city sleeps, the Vestals rest, the flame continues burning, Rome remains secure, the goddess keeps watch, and all is well in this eternal moment before history moves forward again, before dawn brings new day and new duties and the endless continuation of service that defines Vestal life until eventually it doesn't, until even the eternal ends, but not tonight, not yet, not in this peaceful space of sleep and dreams and historical imagination, where ancient Rome still stands and the eternal flame still burns bright.